In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, but the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. This divine act of speaking and creating was a demonstration of God's sovereignty, wisdom, and goodness. Over the course of 6 days, God formed the world, filling it with land, sea, sky, plants, animals, and finally, humans made in his own image. God created humanity, male and female, and blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves on the earth." God entrusted humans with the responsibility to cultivate and care for the Garden of Eden, a perfect paradise where everything was provided and harmonious. This garden was not merely a place of beauty but a divine assignment, a partnership with God to steward creation. The humans were placed in the garden to work it and keep it. They were made in the image of God, the divine reflection, bearing God's likeness in their capacity to rule, create, and care. The purpose of humanity was to represent God's rule on earth, to be his image bearers, reflecting his goodness, creativity, and authority. In that perfect beginning, Adam and Eve enjoyed unbroken fellowship with God. They knew no shame, no conflict, no death, only a relationship of trust, love, and purpose. They experienced the fullness of life, fulfilling their role as co-creators, expanding the garden, and cultivating the world under God's blessing. But amid this harmony, God gave a command. In the midst of the garden stood 2 special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God told Adam and Eve, "You may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." This command was not merely about knowing good and evil but about trusting God's definition of what is good. The tree represented a boundary, a sacred limit, a test of trust in God's wisdom and authority. To eat from that tree was to attempt to grasp moral knowledge independently of God's guidance, a dangerous act symbolizing rebellion, pride, and independence from divine authority. The story unfolds with the serpent, more crafty than any other creature, approaching Eve. He questioned God's command, suggesting that eating the fruit would open her eyes and make her like God, knowing good and evil. The serpent's deception appealed to their desire to be wise and autonomous, tempting them to seize moral knowledge apart from God's boundaries. Eve saw that the fruit was good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable to make one wise. She took of the fruit and ate, then gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate as well. In that act, they chose to trust their own judgment over God's authority, seeking to define good and evil for themselves. Their disobedience was not just a moral failure but a rejection of their divine purpose, to rule as God's representatives through trust and partnership. Immediately, their eyes were opened. They saw their nakedness and felt shame. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. The harmony was broken. Their relationship with God was fractured, and they experienced guilt and fear for the first time. The garden, once a place of unbroken fellowship, became a scene of alienation. God, in his justice and mercy, confronted them. Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent. The consequences of their rebellion were pronounced. The serpent was cursed to crawl on its belly, the woman would experience pain in childbirth and desire for her husband, who would rule over her, and the man would toil and sweat to cultivate the ground, which now produced thorns and thistles. Death entered the human story, and the ground was cursed because of human disobedience. God expelled Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, placing cherubim and a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life, preventing them from eating and living forever in their fallen state. The divine project of partnership was now marred by sin, and the story of humanity turned toward a long journey of redemption and renewal. From that time, the human story became one of conflict, struggle, and moral brokenness. Humanity's attempt to define good and evil outside of God's authority led to chaos, violence, and suffering. Yet, even amid judgment, God's mercy shone through promises of redemption. God clothed Adam and Eve with garments of skin, indicating that sacrifice and atonement were necessary to cover shame and guilt. Throughout history, the story of God's relationship with humanity continued with covenants, promises, and the unfolding of divine purpose. God called Abraham to be the father of a great nation, promising to bless him and make his descendants a blessing to all nations. The Israelites were called to be a light to the nations, reflecting God's justice and mercy, and to embody his image through their covenant relationship. Despite their failures, God's plan persisted. The prophets foretold a coming Messiah, a true human who would perfectly reflect God's image and restore what was broken. Jesus Christ, the Word made flesh, was that fulfillment, the ultimate image of God. In him, God's love, justice, and mercy were fully manifested. Jesus lived a sinless life, perfectly representing God's goodness and purpose. Jesus' life and teachings revealed that the heart of God's purpose for humanity is not merely about rule-keeping or external obedience but about transformation, renewing the inner person so that love for God and neighbor flows from the heart. Jesus summarized the divine law as loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. These commandments encapsulate the true purpose of being made in God's image. Through his death on the cross and resurrection, Jesus accomplished the reconciliation of humanity with God. The cross signifies the ultimate act of divine love and sacrifice, a new beginning where broken relationships are restored. The Spirit of God is poured out upon believers, transforming hearts and enabling them to live out their divine calling, being his image in the world. The biblical story does not depict a perfect world as static but as a dynamic process of growth, healing, and partnership. The Garden of Eden was a beginning, a place of potential and trust. The story continues with God's people participating in the ongoing renewal of creation, expanding the garden through acts of love, justice, and creativity. Believers are called to work with God, to cultivate the world, to build communities characterized by love, peace, and justice. Their work, whether in business, art, education, or family, is part of the divine project of expanding God's kingdom. As co-creators, they reflect God's image by producing goodness, fostering relationships, and stewarding creation responsibly. The narrative also recognizes the presence of evil, suffering, and death in a fallen world. Yet, it affirms that God's ultimate purpose is to restore and renew all things. The final chapters of Revelation describe a new heaven and a new earth, where God's presence dwells with his people, and there is no more death or crying or pain. The divine project reaches its consummation as God's glory fills the earth, and humanity fully reflects his image in perfected harmony. In this grand story, the purpose of humanity is not merely to glorify God passively but to actively participate in his creative and restorative work. To be made in God's image means to represent him responsibly, building, cultivating, and expanding the divine garden. It means trusting God's definition of good, living in love, and working toward the renewal of all creation. Therefore, the chief end of man is to image God by representing his goodness, his love, and his justice, and to live out that purpose in every aspect of life. Whether in work, relationships, or worship, believers are invited into the divine mission to partner with God in expanding his garden of love and life, until the whole earth is filled with his glory. This is the overarching story the Bible tells, a story of creation, rebellion, redemption, and renewal. It calls each person to participate in God's ongoing work, trusting in the ultimate hope that one day, all things will be made new, and God's glory will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And so, as God's image bearers, we are called to live with purpose, stewardship, and love, expanding the divine garden in every corner of the world. And now, as you reflect on this story, consider how your daily work, relationships, and choices participate in God's grand design. How can you embody the divine image more fully? How can you cultivate love, justice, and mercy wherever you are? Remember, your life is part of this divine project, a sacred calling to represent God's goodness and to help bring about his kingdom on earth. Let us live with that purpose, glorifying God and enjoying him forever.